Hey guys, welcome. I want to talk a little bit today about scope, I suppose I would call it, or complexity of your character, right? Just because I did finally finish my retopo, I feel like I got to that point where I can start unwrapping. I did have to go back and add some spheres for eyeballs. Don't forget to do that to your character. It does help shape the eye socket region. Um, but before I progress on the full unwrap, just wanted to mention, how long it took to get to this stage from this stage. Now, I had to go through the process of high poly modeling, right, from this base sculpt or this base box model into a sculpt, and then a retopology using the quad draw, right, if you watch those videos. Um, which I think is worth going over because just when I was learning to model, we were always kind of taught the fastest possible way, but it is good to know the full pipeline, right, for when you need to do a portfolio piece or a complete character that you want to maybe show off or be proud of, right? It's nice having gone through the full range of motions and potentially flipping to different softwares, right? Like I did use Mudbox a tiny bit on this character. I didn't use it for the sculpting this time, but I did use it to identify some errors. So let's just look at that for a second because it is a free tool for us since we can get a student license through our Autodesk account. But what you can do is import your final 3D model into Mudbox. Right, in this case I had my retopo, so let's just look at if I import it. It will tell you that there are problems, right? And this is important to know about, right? It's better to know that there's a problem and choose some way to fix it or to bypass it than to just get caught unawares until it gets all the way to game engine, because some of these problems can cause say see-through parts on your model once you get into Unity or Unreal, right? So in this case, I like Mudbox just because it will flag these problem areas right away, and it did get me to go back and fix some parts. Like for instance, what I had here is I had two faces on top of each other, just below the beard. I also had two faces on top of each other on the nose, and a few vertices that were floating and not contributing to any change in direction on that edge, right? If there's a vert and it's still a straight edge with or without the vert, Mudbox will detect that is probably not something that you want, right? Mudbox is fun though for going in and sculpting. If you want to give it a shot, you can subdivide these models by hitting I think it's shift D to decimate, we call it, and that is just like smoothing the mesh over here inside of Maya, right? Don't forget, once you get to a higher enough poly model, you can also test the smooth mesh by hitting 3 on your keyboard. For a model of this complexity, it's not going to give you that good of a result, so I don't really tend to use the smooth mesh preview when I'm working on a low poly model, right? But now for these guys, obviously this one being 100,000 faces just for the body, this guy being, he's definitely not 60,000 faces, I believe he is about 3,500 faces in his final form, right? So 3,500 faces without armor, right? This week I need to be getting back into modeling armor. And on that note, right, remember when I first started you guys off on this project, how much stress I was putting on, creating interesting shapes and using shape language to communicate the vibe or the personality of your character. And even if you go all the way to a super high poly sculpt, right, it still matters more to have found something interesting in the design at the beginning, right? Because just changing the helmet on a character actually changes quite a lot in terms of personality, right? So if, say, like in my character, they're going to be wearing a helmet, we don't need to see their face, right, directly. Again, just skip the face, right? Just don't even put yourself through it, right? Like this one, initially, you would never even know that there wasn't a head under there unless you really looked, right? Because the helmet sells it, right? At a distance, you just accept that there's a head in there. The other problem being that once you start to decimate, once you start to get your edge loops closer and closer together, right? You're adding more and more detail to your model. But that just means that you have more areas that you have to add detail to, right? So now a very low poly helmet isn't going to cut it for this character right now. I need to go back and really make this helmet look interesting. In the real world, right, once you get to the level that you are sculpting out your character anatomy to a very high level of detail, right, with musculature and these landmarks of anatomy on the body that we call them, right, these points that our eyes just look to measure proportions subconsciously. So this is like the belly button, right, the top of the shoulders, how wide the shoulders are, right. We gain a lot of information instantaneously without having to think about it. The problem is that then, right, you're also going to have to scale up the quality of your attached pieces. So in a AAA or even an A level pipeline, right, for a high quality game, they're going to go straight to sculpting, even with the armor and any accessories, right, weapons. All of that stuff is just going to be pushed to the maximum level because you can, once you hit like a high level of quality for one piece, you need to raise the quality for all attached pieces, right? But don't forget, like we've looked at speed modeling now, right? When you're in a sort of crunch position, or you just want to be rapid prototyping your game, you just want to be able to get your character's voice into that game very quickly, right? Without just looking at a cylinder running around or a very blocky character, right? Like we did for the 3D level design, being very basic humanoid character. If you can learn to push these proportions and this shape language, right, just through the silhouette of your character and capture that very quickly, right, in a 1 hour, 2 hour 3D character model, right, you don't need to go through the headache of sculpting, retopo, and then again an advanced unwrap, which I'll get into. I recorded a video for that last night, but then Maya crashed after I had unwrapped the hands, so I was calling it a night after that one. But this level, right, like this at a distance, remember we were talking about a MOBA game here, not about a first-person shooter or something like a cyberpunk where you're going to be like seeing the character flutter their eyelashes at you, and like that emotional connection, it comes from that very tight distance between you and that character, right? In a MOBA, in a third-person game, right, that character's only going to be about so big on the screen. We're not going to catch all that information about, like, that I've spent hours worrying about in here, of like, ooh, do his eyes communicate the fiery pain that he's feeling in his soul, right? Like at like 5 meters back, when you raise the camera up into a play style, right, into a gameplay sort of camera angle, how much more information are you really getting, right? Like it's tough to be able to get to this level of complexity, but it's also only necessary for certain situations, right? When the camera is very close in and intimate. And when we're modeling, we do have to be close in because we need to see where that vertex is and to be able to grab it, right? But you do need to remember to take a step back, and this is why I recommend setting your Unity scenes up like right away when you're dealing with a new character, whether it's making a cinematic or a game, just because we want to be able to sense, okay, how close am I actually getting to this character or this object, right? To be able to determine like what kind of level of detail do we need on that character, yeah? So for, you know, a third-person game, if you're over the shoulder or something, yeah, I gotta cover up this guy because I'm getting sick of looking at his behind. You know, a mid-level poly count, great. Are people gonna care that it's a low poly character? Not really. Like, this is perfectly acceptable, right? And this guy literally only took me about an hour to model. Plus, you know, a little bit of extra time for polish. I could still go back here because I've used quad modeling techniques, right? I forgo triangles as much as possible, so I can just grab the multi-cut tool and insert edge loops if I need to make him a little bit more rounded out, right? If I need to get a little bit more texture information on there, or have more of his armor pieces and things as part of the original model, right? I don't have to necessarily be able to model out a perfect anatomy on all of my characters, right? Because now I need to go to the trouble of making my armor at about the same level of complexity as this mid-tier model. For most projects, you want to be able to just get something into the game, and most players will just accept that that's the level, right? So that's what I wanted to just remind you guys about, right? Especially if you are not confident in your modeling skills, right? Don't beat yourself up about it, because this project is tough for everybody, no matter what level you're at 3D wise. Modeling a character is probably the most difficult thing that you can do. So that said, let's go take a look at this character Unwrap, so that we can just give you guys some insight into let's just see, into how to tackle some of these trickier areas. So even on this character, I might want to give you guys an option. We never worry about unwrapping high poly characters, right? We always unwrap the mid or low poly version. And then what happens is and we've talked about this in some other videos, we use projection, right, to tell the mid poly texture how much to push and pull the verts based on the difference between the low or the mid poly and the higher poly model, right? So we could do the same thing even on a low poly, right? I could still pull this normal map from the high poly onto my low poly model. Of course, it's not going to be as nice, right, as one that has been custom fit. So high poly can go bye-bye. We don't need him, right? They live in ZBrush usually, right, or Mudbox. I did it in Maya just because I thought it was going to be a quick little round the carousel, and it turned out to be the longest part of this project for me. So hopefully some of you decided to challenge yourself, right, and do some high poly sculpting, or at least touch the sculpting tools for maybe the face. But if you stuck around in low polyville, that's what I wanted. That's what I'm expecting for this project for most of you. So please make an effort to get to around this level, right? And this model has less than 700 faces compared to, like I said, 3,700. So 3,000 more polygons with no armor cost me probably 20 or 40 hours worth of modeling. Whether you want to charge people for that, right? Spend your time on it in a real studio. It's up to you, but it does take some leveling up of skill sets as well, right? You have to go learn some more anatomy, get more conscious about using reference, right? Real life photo reference. Whereas if you're working more stylistically, right, you can get away with more, which is always nice as an artist. Yeah. So if I was tackling these models, right, I would go about it the same way. I just have more edges and more polygons to worry about in a higher poly model. But let's look at how I would tackle the low poly, just because it's going to be a little bit more clear on the screen. So start by opening my UV Unwrap tool. This is just an automatic unwrap from the default tool settings. So I never use the automatic unwrap. I know that with Substance Painter it can do some magic where it can stitch pixels together basically. It's not a good place to rely on it though. I'd rather let Substance do its job, which is making beautiful texture maps. So I'm going to use usually the polygon lasso tool, and I'm going to start with the simplest object, typically the leg. Okay. I want to be looking for the loop that kind of separates that object from the torso in this case. And we've talked about a little bit in the past how texture seams are pretty much the same places as clothing seams, right? So say on my hoodie here, it was sewn together, right? The arm is sewn onto the other pieces of material, and then even the arm is stitched together itself, right? It has a seam down the bottom. And we use that same seam for arms in real life. So if we're talking about arms, let's just go ahead and grab the arm. So I've done a few, did both the legs last night on the high poly, so it's good to switch it up. Alright, so the arm, I'll typically terminate the seam at about the t-shirt line, right? So I can choose whether to include more of the shoulder or more of the clavicle kind of neck area, right? Depending on my topology. For a low poly, this is going to be fine. Usually I'll keep the hand as a separate element just because there are so many different curves associated with the hand, so I'll terminate at the wrist. Then I'll go to UV, use the cylindrical unwrap. Right, I can see the ghost of the cylinder around the arm. The viewport. What I want to do is look around until I see the bottom of the cylinder, and there's this little red T. Click on the T, and a new pivot will appear, right, just for the cylinder itself. Notice that I can't access the rotation pivots until I click on the outer rotation, right? So you can rotate the outer ring by aligning the camera perpendicular to where you want it to rotate to. Or if you want to use the world rotations, just click on the outer ring once, and then that will give you the ability to rotate the shell projection in world space rather than in, actually it is in component space, which is nice. So part of this, why we need the little T, is to line up the cylinder as closely as possible with the arm. But also to line up the seam. So I do this this way just because I like this little tool. I guess I got used to it once I taught it to myself. But you could do this manually as well. I could forgo this tool and just work from the model and go from there. Now notice that I can see the seam here, which is highlighted in white on the wireframe. And again, I want to start thinking about, in terms of clothing, where the cuts are going to be. So we just looked at the hoodie example, and one of the cuts is kind of under the arm. So rather than being in the front, I only have one poly at the bottom of the arm, since it doesn't say low poly. And I just want to bring up my UV editor. It's quite large right now. I'll scale it down a little bit. I don't have to worry about how things look. Sometimes I'll grab it at this stage just to move it out of U1, V1, right? And probably move all these other puzzle pieces out of the main U1, V1 square, right? So this is now my arm shell. Of course, it is not unwrapped yet, but we just got started. So what we want to do is get into edge mode, choose the seam that we want to cut along. So think of it like if you were disassembling a piece of clothing rather than putting it together, right? The cut is going to be on that inside sleeve. So anywhere where there is not a white line from my cylindrical unwrap, I just want to click on that edge and choose cut. I believe it also has a shortcut, Shift X. You might have to be within this window. Let's test that out. Shift X. Yeah, you do have to middle click into the UV editor window to use the shortcut Shift X. Otherwise, just click on the little button here. And anywhere that I don't want a seam, I'm going to click on those white lines on the wireframe and just choose sew. So that is going to stitch those back up, and it is going to create a mess on the visual representation there. But still, I want to sew more of these unintentional cuts up, so I'm just going to keep hitting sew until I only have the seams that I want. So in my case, it is this one I first talked about around the shoulder, right? The seam that goes underneath the arm on the inside of the arm, and then another seam at the wrist. So I have all those cuts, and I have sewn all the other ones up, right? So all the rest of the wireframe in that area is blue, and my cuts are represented with white. Now I go back to my UV editor, click on, or right click and choose UV shell so I can select that whole arm. Now all I need to do is use the built-in tools to optimize the space inside of the, to fix kind of the texel density, how much space it's going to take up. So I click unfold once. It's going to do a really nice job of unfolding that organic object and laying it out flat. And then usually I'll click optimize a few times, and that just seems to improve the overall shape and with the least amount of texture distortion, right? So now I've got a big chunk of arm. I'll move that into U1 V1, right? An arm is only going to take up about yay amount of room on the unwrap. Typically, you know, for a larger model with a face, the face like we looked at with the JoJo model inside of the chat, the face will often take up almost a quarter of the unwrap if that character's face is going to be shown. Alright, so next we've got the other arm waiting, right? And the other arm has not been unwrapped at all. So here I am with face mode again. Maybe use this the lasso unwrap or lasso selection, and then I'm just going to grab all of the polys corresponding to the ones that I grabbed on the other side. If I go to the selection tool, I can also hold tab to paint in my selection on the faces. So I'm just going to check if I got all the pieces. Looks like there's a few hiding back here underneath. Maybe I can put it inside. Ooh, got a mosquito. Alright, so I've got the same selection. I can check that by just checking where the seams are, right? I want to just do a cylindrical unwrap, and this time let's just ignore the cylinder unwrap, right? Let's just say we don't even care what the cylinder does for us. Right? Oh, the only thing is that now it has chosen to sew a few of those edges. So we'll have to go to edge mode, select the cuts that we don't want, okay, and choose sew. There might be a few more up hidden inside the shoulder that I still need to look for. Nope, looks like it's clear. So then I can just manually choose this inside seam at the back of the arm. The cylindrical unwrap already cut the wrist for me, and it cut the shoulder. So really that's the only line that I need to cut. Hit cut, go to UV shell, choose unfold, hit optimize a couple times, and it's given me the same shape, just reflected over for the other arm. Now, when I am in this situation, personally, I like to stack my UVs so that the symmetry takes care of the texture on the opposite side, right? That way I don't have to have double the amount of space taken up. Anytime there's an arm texture, it should just go onto the opposite arm as well. So in order to stack these manually, you can go to the transform dropdown, choose flip along the U, and then just align these with one another. Yeah. If there's a good amount of disparity between the shapes, right, you can still, you can try to optimize. Just remember, you can't optimize when it is flipped. You have to flip it back, optimize, and then flip it again. The one that was not flipped over, I can optimize freely. Yeah. But it is going to be slightly off. Now, there are copy and paste tools within the UV Unwrap. However, they typically don't work. Let's just put it that way. Unless the object is the same and is not being rotated. Let's see if we do select an edge to define a topology scene. Okay. Control middle mouse to adjust the symmetry position. Interesting. Okay, maybe I don't want to do that. How do I get out of this mode? Back to selection. So yeah, like usual, the built-in tools with Maya, not super reliable, even within its own system. So can usually just get away with stacking the two manually. Remember, the closer you zoom in, the more accurate you can get, right? If there's a particular edge that you want to line up exactly. If you want to be 100% exact with this, you can also go to the UV selection mode. And then in that tool, what I'll do is I'll select the verts that should be on top of each other, and you can scale them down to 0. Or I believe there's also a tool for that, the align tool. So if you hit align, oh, no, they're not going to quite get together. So again, manually being the best way in Maya. It's just one of those apps. There are definitely tools for this though, so it is unfortunate that Maya can't keep up, even in the latest version. All right. Anyway, so again, I start with simple object and I use the cylindrical unwrap. Once I have the unwrap, I put it back into the U1V1 and let it hold its ground. Legs are going to be almost exactly the same. Select up to the underwear line approximately. You can include the foot or disconnect the foot, right? If you're going to do a boot that has a very clear piece of geometry where it ends, probably just want to remove the boot. It also makes your unwrap slightly easier. Again, the leg is a cylinder. Start with the cylinder just so that we get the start of the seam, right? So the messing with the cylindrical shell right here. It's just so that we can start to see where a good spot for the seam might be. So again, our goal is always to hide it from the player or from the viewer. So between the legs, probably the good spot, and towards the back between the legs, if anything. And edge mode, stitch up the seams that we don't want, or sew rather than, not stitch. Select the seam that I do want, hit cut. Alright, no other seams remaining, so I go back to UV editor, click the shell, do an unfold, and optimize, and I get this nice organic shape. The reason why we want this shape to be more organic, right, is because if we check the checkerboard mode, right, it does a very nice job of getting all of these checkers to be almost perfectly square with the least amount of distortion, right? So that's actually where it's going to be stretching your pixels if there is distortion on the checkerboard mode. And as and then hitting optimize, right, will just try to push that perfection even more. However, sometimes optimize will optimize in the wrong place, right? Maybe it's like optimizing the back of the leg and it's making the front of the leg worse, for instance, right? You don't necessarily know until you hit that little optimize button what it's going to be doing. Oh, a quick way to select the opposite leg, which I should have mentioned earlier, is go to UV shell mode, select the leg that you just unwrapped, go to symmetry and choose object symmetry. Ooh, my object is not perfectly symmetrical, so I would go to, maybe I need to go to face mode first. So I select the shell, yeah, it doesn't look like my guy's perfectly symmetrical for whatever reason, but it works well on other characters. I guess I have a shell on this guy, right? So if I click on the shell, maybe go to face mode just to be sure, choose Object X, right? It will select the opposite geometry, then I can turn symmetry mode off. It'll keep that selection, go back to the UV editor, UV shell, and then I can just deselect the leg that I don't want. So, quick way to select the opposite region, right? So again, UV shell mode, select the leg, turn symmetry on, switch to face mode, maybe grab these two faces that it did not recognize as being symmetrical. Then go back to UV shell mode and, oops, turn off symmetry, back to UV shell mode, and then you can shift click on the side that you don't need to be selecting, right? So those are all the pieces for the leg. We'll just do a quick UV cylinder to separate it into its own UV shell, right? Then check that the seam is where we want it. I believe I was using this line. Double check. Okay, it's that first inside line. Go to edge mode. Sew any edges that I don't want cut, and then select the ones that I do want. Choose cut. Select the last one, cut, and select the leftovers and hit sew. UV shell. Unfold. If you get a little gap like this, just go to edge mode and sew those together. Looks like I probably have, I just missed that when I cut it. If you do sew something, just do another unfold or another optimize if you optimize. Then again, bring it back down to its a symmetrical neighbor, flip it over, and get it nice and snug and into place on top of its friend. Some engines or renderers don't like this method, right? They'll actually, and Mudbox is one of them, where it'll give you a warning. Others will put up with your shenanigans, but it is worth noting that occasionally you do need to avoid using this flip method, right, to stack your UVs on top of each other. Alrighty, getting down to the torso. So face mode, maybe I'll select the middle faces, use shift period to grow selection, use tab to paint additional selection. And for the torso, we can just do a kind of a front and back seam. So we obviously don't want the back to be symmetrical, because then he would have nipples on his shoulder blades. So we want to keep those two UV shells separated. Get our selection nice and clean. Just the parts that haven't been unwrapped, check. We can also check here to make sure that none of that's been touched. Alright, so that's what we're working with. Since we're going to be focusing on a front and back, we can start by just doing a camera based from the front axis. The front orthographic camera, middle click inside there, choose camera based. Now I don't think it has created seams for me yet, so then go to edge mode, select the seam. We'll use, I would just continue the line that we made for the legs. We'll use the cut operation, and then again come to the top, find the middle seam. We can do front and back. You could also move that cut back a bit, right? Just again to hide the seam from the player. You might want to have it further towards the back. But I'm happy with that. Still gotta cut the sides. You can look for the seam that we made for the shirt and just use the same line there. Cut those. Alright, now that they're cut, we can go to UV shell mode and separate out the chest. And then you can use unfold, right, or just optimize to create optimal shapes for the front and the back. And then move them into an open spot inside of U1V1. It's probably around this point where you can either just turn on checkerboard mode and eyeball it, right, to see how much bigger or smaller different objects need to be to have the same texel density across the entire character or the entire object. Or potentially you can use the built-in tool, which is to select all of the islands. I'm not sure if it's going to complain about the flipped UV shells, so it is under modify and then layout, and everything that you have selected, okay, so it doesn't matter if it's flipped or not, everything that you have selected will be placed onto U1V1, and will also unify the texel density across all of those unwrapped objects, which is handy. Alright, trickier bits. Feet are very easy. Feet are just a cylindrical unwrap, and then typically the cuts that I use are the back of the heel down along the bottom of the sole of the foot. The hands are much like the torso. You want to use the probably the camera based, or just rotate your perspective camera into a good location and use UV camera based from within the perspective window, right? Sometimes you can get away with that. And then again, like the torso, cut them down the center, right? Separate the front and the back, and then that way you can stack the two tops of the hand and the two bottoms of the hand if you so choose. Alrighty, so that's the low poly. Let's increment and save him so that we can always come back if I want to do the low poly finalized version. Otherwise, let's take a look at the big guy here, Mr. Worldwide. I don't even know what that reference is, but I've heard it floating around. Apologies. Okay, so for this guy, I was working on the hands when Maya decided to shut down last night. So for the hands, you have two options. You can keep it looking like a hand, which is better for painting a hand, right, if you're going to be stylized, just so that you can keep it in your brain of what you're painting. Because once you hit the unfold on a hand, it's going to splay it out, and it's going to look weird, right? Your brain is going to reject it as a hand a little bit because it's so freaky looking. Same with the bottom of the hand, right? It creates a similar shape, and now you have to keep track of which one of these has fingernails and which one of these has fingertips. It's not immediately clear, right? You will get a better texel density though, so let's look if we have this is the inside of the hand and this is the top of the hand. Let's look at the texture stretching here. So at the top of the hand here, right, this is using the splayed glove. Once I've hit unfold, very nice even texel density, right? All these squares are about the same size and with very little stretching. For the hand that still looks like a hand or like a glove, that I have not unfolded, let's take a closer look. And for the most part, we're getting good results. It's just going to be on the curvature that where we see a lot of stretching, right? So oftentimes stretching is less important if you're doing stylized assets because it's going to be maybe a flat color in that region anyway, right? Not much in terms of gradients that are going to get stretched. You can see I just made my texture seams right down the center. You could also even push that line maybe to the tops where the fingernails are, right? There's a bit of a color change there. Let's look at the head though, because it's definitely the most intimidating, but not the most difficult. The main thing is just to know where the seam is for the head, because obviously that's one that we don't have a clothing equivalent, right? Where we're going to be cutting things open. So for the head, typically the seam is going to be past the hairline, right? So that we can hide things in the hairline. Or somewhere, you know, at the very top of the head and split all the way down the back. As you can see here, the edge flow goes, or the cut that I made goes all the way from the top of the head down the back. Typically, I would want to start it sort of in line with where the face starts in a relative sense, right, from the side view. Since this guy's bald, I pushed the cut a little bit backwards just so that if I did have a texture here, right, that the seam wouldn't be visible. Also, another place to hide cuts is behind the ears here. Again, think of places that the camera or the player is never going to look, right? Or even if they do look, they're not going to be mouthy about complaining that that the texture looks bad in those areas because nobody really cares. Do look out for things like this where the automatic unwrap is actually cut a whole chunk of my ear off of the face. So this is what the face looks like right now with an unfold and an optimize, right? But if there are holes, you want to go and fix those before you call it a day, right? So you click on a seam, find it inside the UV editor. First try stitch together. That will often find that middle missing piece and it'll just put it in place and to scale. And then I can sew the nearby stuff to it, right? So again, look for a missing one, hit stitch together. Okay, now it's just brought a whole line, and I can see that this line of polys connects here. I have a couple options, right? I do want to stitch together or sew together as many of these edges as I can. Right, I don't necessarily want any seams on the face, but it gets a little bit tricky when things are bent out of shape like this. You can just go to the UV selection mode and select UVs and just stack them on top of each other. I find that this just makes sense to my brain a little bit more. Right, so knowing that I've got a vertex there that needs to go in place, right? I can just drag those vertices around into their approximate location and then let the sew operation take care of the fine details, right? So I've got the vertices in place or the UVs in place, then I can just switch over, click on the edges and do a sew. If you skip an edge, you can actually double your time by just hitting sew. It will sew both of those edges, right? Now here I've got quite a large disparity in the size of these edges, even though they are the same size in 3D. So when I hit sew, it is going to approximate the middle ground. Let's see what else we got going on here. Might be another hole, yep. So I just need to do some sewing, and then we got that ear stitched up. Same thing over here. Stitch together, sew. Now let's just see if we just like slam this in without worrying about the shape, what kind of things are going to happen. Just because when we do the unfold operation, it is going to take care of us for the most part. So I'm curious just how strong that is. So we'll do one side in a very brushed way, just to get rid of all these white lines, and then see if the unfold results in the same shape on both sides. All right, so there's all the white edges gone. Go to UV shell, choose unfold again, optimize a few times, and it looks identical on both sides. So yeah, that one did a nice job. Typically for a face, you might have some asymmetry, right? You might have a mole on one side of your face or a scar or something on a character's face, in which case you want to keep both sides of the face on the UVs. But much like the arms and legs, sometimes you just want the higher resolution, right? Especially if you're working with like a 1024 texture or 512 texture and you're having to fit a whole character on that texture. You're going to want to look for these tricks of how to maximize the UVs, even if you have to deal with symmetry, right? So you'll see it in a lot of low poly characters. Only half of the face is going to be on the texture, right? And to do that, we would just split the face down the center edge here. Let's see, did it select on the whole model or just that shell? Okay, it's just that shell. So let's select that center line on the face, do a cut. That's created a new UV shell. Now I can just flip it, stack it. It should be close. Looks like it's like ever so slightly unaligned, but yeah. So now at least, right, if I needed to take up more room on the texture with my face, because you have a 1024 texture or a 512 texture, you might just need those extra pixels, right? So actually, might have an example of that. Actually, let me pull it up. So here we have from, I believe it's Skyward Sword Zelda, Link's character model, right, and all his textures. He has many textures on him, most likely because he carries so much different equipment, right? So maybe that's the reason. They also do animations on his texture, which is a bit unusual. You can see for the face, right, this texture at 100% is quite small. It might only be 256 by 256 for the whole face. Yeah. So in order to maximize the resolution and get like all these nice little eyebrow hairs and edges of hairs on his face to show right when it's actually displayed on screen, in that texture they've gone ahead and cut the face in half, which has given them all this extra room that they can then use, in this case for the ears, for the teeth, and probably the inside of the mouth. Not sure what this is, or in this area. Alrighty, so that pretty much takes care of the unwrap stuff though, right? Think about it in terms of clothing and in terms of cylinders, and you shouldn't have much issue, right? If you run into trickier objects, your first stop is also going to be cylindrical or spherical potentially, but then really going into edge mode, selecting an edge, creating cuts manually, is going to give you the best results, right? Especially now that the unfold and optimize tools are working well compared to earlier versions of Maya. So I'll leave it at that, guys. Happy unwrapping. Remember, you need to do the unwrap in order to get it running in Substance Painter, but do test it out along the way, right? Like don't plan on just like it being perfect the first time that you import it into Substance. Every single time I've brought anything into Substance, I've always noticed that there's some sort of issue with my UVs, and I've had to go back to Maya and export again, right? Nobody ever gets it to 100% the first try, so do plan on that iteration, that ping-ponging back and forth a little bit. But again, this is the kind of level of detail I expect to see from you guys. If you push it to high level of detail, you know, then you're looking at it first, and you're also challenging yourself in a good way, right? Your art is going to evolve, and your skills are going to level up if you go through the trouble of doing the AAA pipeline methods. So try to enjoy it. Have fun with this stuff, guys. If you get burned out on one thing, say modeling, try to switch gears, go over to the cinematic, go over to Unity, and give yourself a break. And then come back to the modeling with fresh eyes. So, hope that helps. We'll be in next week, Wednesday or Friday for you guys, like usual. So I'll have the Zoom link posted. Cheers.